الأمير ليس مستغربا. لا استقبل.
لا عم بصير 7 أياد بشكل آخر.
Afternoon, and thank you for joining us on FutureTV. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are today's top stories. Lebanese Patriarch Bashar al-Assad and former Prime Minister Saad Hariri meet in Paris, where they reiterate their warning against a presidential vacuum. President Michel Sleiman congratulates workers on the occasion of International Labor Day. The United Nations Aid Chief Valerie Amos says the humanitarian situation in Syria is getting worse, with less than 10% of those in besieged areas getting aid. Lebanese Patriarch Bashar al-Assad reiterates his warnings against a presidential vacuum, saying that a new president capable of uniting the Lebanese people must be elected. Following his meeting with former Prime Minister Saad Hariri in Paris, Rai said Lebanon must come out with a new president capable of meeting the needs and aspirations of the Lebanese people. Discussions with Hariri addressed the characteristics of a president who can unite the Lebanese, ease the divisions among them, and bring them all together around the state and its institutions. Rai describes a possible vacuum in the presidential post as a national crime against Lebanon and says he will exert all efforts to avoid it. The Patriarch states he did not discuss the names of presidential candidates with Hariri, arguing it is the task of parliamentary and political blocs to propose names. President Michel Sleiman has congratulated workers on the occasion of International Labor Day. In a public statement from Baghdad Palace, the president reiterated that laborers are the backbone of the country's economic rise. The president said it is important to take into consideration the actual standing of the treasury in a bid to secure the interest of all Lebanese when striving to meet their demands. He concluded by wishing stability in the country. The army has arrested 5 suspects in Beirut's southern suburbs after seizing ammunition and military equipment from 2 separate residences. A military statement identifies the suspects as Mohammed Mazloum and his sons Ali and Hassan, as well as Salim Ahmed Ismail and Mohammed Saeed Wahbi. The 5 suspects are wanted on charges of discharging weapons, but the military did not disclose additional details, and investigations with the suspects are underway. Foreign Minister Gibran Bassil says the descendants of Lebanese expatriates may soon have easier path to citizenship. Bassil says he received political promises from both Speaker Nabih Berri and the Future Movement that they will back a draft law to allow grandchildren of Lebanese paternal grandfathers to apply for citizenship. Under the current law, expatriates can only receive citizenships from their father. The minister also says expatriates should play an influential role in the political future of the country by voting, adding that they should also have lawmakers specifically representing them. The latest draft law would help Lebanese expatriates take part in future parliamentary elections by voting at Lebanese embassies abroad. The Lebanese Communist Party has held a protest for the occasion of Labor Day, in which protesters voiced their rejection of proposed tax increases that a parliamentary committee is discussing to cover civil servant wage raises. Syndicate Coordination Committee Hanna Gharib took part in the protest, which also condemned the new renting law and called for ending unemployment. The Lebanese parliament never reached an agreement on sources of funding for the public employees' ranks and salary scales, and a parliamentary committee was formed to restudy the wage increase. Clashes between Syrian government forces and opposition fighters have killed 14 rebels in a flare-up overnight along the strategic corridor between Damascus and the Lebanese border. The fighting in Zabadani, a town near Damascus, and the last rebel stronghold in the area is part of the larger battle for control of the mountainous Qalamun region. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the latest bout of clashes has an unknown number of soldiers. Another activist group, the Syria-based Local Coordination Committee, says government aircraft dropped 4 crude bombs on Zabadani overnight. United Nations Aid Chief Valerie Amos describes the humanitarian situation in Syria as getting worse, with less than 10% of those in besieged areas getting aid.
It's now 2 months since Resolution 2319 was adopted, and as you know, the Secretary-General presented his report to the Council last week. It makes very grim reading. Far from getting better, the situation is getting worse. Violence has intensified over the past month, taking a horrific toll on ordinary Syrians. I'm extremely concerned that less than 10% of the 242,000 people living in besieged areas received assistance in the past 4 weeks. I told the Council that there has been little progress since my last briefing. And in fact, I told them that each month I report on the relentless killing and maiming of civilians, the destruction of homes, schools and places of worship, the blatant disregard for life, and the total disregard by all parties for the fundamental tenets of international humanitarian law. The parties appear to be engaged in an endless spiral of targeting and harming civilians for tactical purposes.
And coming up next, thousands around the world hold rallies on the occasion of International Labor Day. More after the break. Welcome back. 6 suspected al-Qaeda militants have been killed in Yemen as Yemeni troops backed by aircraft pressed a ground offensive in the south. The assault that began overnight focused on the Shabwa province towns of Maifa and Azan. 3 vehicles were destroyed along with the 6 suspected militants traveling in them. The army launched a major offensive on Tuesday aimed at clearing the jihadists from the remaining strongholds in villages and smaller towns in Shabwa and neighboring Abiyan province. The operation began with a setback for the army when a convoy fell into an al-Qaeda ambush in which 15 soldiers were killed and 15 more taken prisoners, 3 of whom were later executed. So far, a total of 21 soldiers and 21 suspected militants have been reported killed in the ground offensive, which followed intense U.S. and Yemeni airstrikes last week. Vote counting is underway in Iraq after Iraqis braved attacks to participate in parliamentary elections that incumbent Premier Nouri al-Maliki says he was certain of winning. Wednesday's general elections took place as further violence rocked the country, with 14 people killed shortly after polling started. Preliminary results are not expected for at least 2 weeks. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says Iraqis have courageously voted, sending a powerful rebuke to the violent extremists both in Iraq and the region. The UN Security Council urges Iraq's leaders to form a government as soon as possible that represents the will and sovereignty of the Iraqi people. Many Iraqis state that they have cast their vote despite the unrest because they were fed up with their elected officials. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Deschista accuses Russian troops of infiltrating and destabilizing the east of the country, saying Moscow plans to invade and annex other regions. This comes after his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov suggested both sides should hold talks under the aegis of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Deschista says that special troops from the Russian army and intelligence have infiltrated eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian official says the Geneva Agreement remained on paper as Russia had done nothing to implement its terms. He states that he understood the West will not enter an armed conflict with Russia, but that sanctions should be brought against decision makers, including the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And now for news around the world in brief, hundreds in the United States have been rescued from fast rising waters when nearly 2 feet of rain fell on the Florida Panhandle and Alabama coast in the span of about 24 hours. The latest bout of severe weather that began with tornadoes in the U.S. Midwest. The floods are considered the worst in the region in decades. Scores of young girls and women kidnapped from a school in Nigeria are being forced to marry their Boko Haram abductors. This is according to a local human rights group, which says more than 200 girls who were kidnapped 2 weeks ago had been sold to the fighters for $12. Dozens of protesters gathered outside Nigeria's parliament, calling on security forces to intensify their search for the girls. 2 bombs planted on a train have killed a 22-year-old female passenger and wounded 9 others in the main southern Indian city of Chennai. Today's blast occurred in 2 coaches just as the train was approaching the city's central station. 2 of the 9 injured were being treated in the hospital for serious injuries while police investigated and bomb squads checked the train for more explosive devices. Thousands of people from around the world have held rallies on the occasion of International Labor Day. Workers in the South Korean capital of Seoul held a rally to demand better working conditions and commemorate victims of the sunken ferry. Thousands of workers gathered in front of the main train station and chanted slogans to protest against the government's labor policies. During the rally, workers paid silent tribute to victims who died after a ferry carrying 476 passengers capsized on April 16th. The workers attached yellow ribbons on their jackets as a symbol of good luck to wish for a safe return of the missing passengers. Thousands of demonstrators marched in the Malaysian capital of Kuala Lumpur to protest against goods and services tax. Similarly, more than 500 garment factory workers rallied in Cambodia to demand a minimum wage raise. Neanderthals lost the human race, but were no less intelligent than the early modern humans who replaced them, according to the archaeological research that bucks stereotypes of slope-browed dimwits. The study, conducted by two researchers at Leiden University in the Netherlands, concludes that modern humanity's closest instinct relatives were no less advanced in hunting, language, and culture than their contemporaries. More in this report.
Until recently, modern humans and Neanderthals were generally regarded as distinct species that had a common ancestor perhaps 500,000 years ago, and then they went their separate evolutionary ways. But recent research has shown that it's a little bit more complicated than that. About 60,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were a very widespread species. They ranged all the way from Spain and Gibraltar, right across at times to Siberia. We think that modern humans had evolved in Africa, and about 60,000 years ago they were beginning to emerge from Africa and they were coming into the Middle East. And this meant that they would encounter the Neanderthals, and there seems to have been an overlap between those modern humans who came out of Africa with the Neanderthals. That overlap might have been 10, 20, 30,000 years. The majority view until recently was that those groups remained distinct. If there was any interbreeding, it was thought that it was on such a small scale we would find no trace of it today. But recent research suggests that indeed not only was there some interbreeding, but that interbreeding does go through to the present day. DNA research on Neanderthals and modern humans show that most people outside of Africa have a component of Neanderthal DNA which traces back to that interbreeding, about the level of 2% in people outside of Africa. For these modern humans who came into Western Asia and interbred with the Neanderthals, we think they then spread out and essentially were the ancestors of all the rest of the people outside of Africa. So they took their small bit of DNA with them as they spread out towards Europe, towards Australia, towards Asia, eventually even into the Americas. The fact that many people today have got Neanderthal DNA in them does make us rethink what it is to be a modern human. We know that we are not purely recent African origin. The DNA that modern humans have from Neanderthals, a lot of it seems to be non-coding, essentially neutral, but there are parts of it which do seem to be in some way functional. There's a view that we might have acquired part of our immune systems through interbreeding with Neanderthals. And there's also a view that perhaps there were some negatives in the interbreeding with Neanderthals, that possibly some diseases in modern humans are due to the presence of Neanderthal DNA.
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our top stories. Maronite Patriarch Shadada and former Prime Minister Saad Hariri meet in Paris, where they reiterate their warning against a presidential vacuum. President Michel Sleiman congratulates workers on the occasion of International Labor Day. And UN Aid Chief Valerie Amos says the humanitarian situation in Syria is getting worse, with less than 10% of those in besieged areas getting aid. Those are today's headlines here from us at Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, wishing you all a very happy Labor Day.
الغياب ليس مستغربا.
اللي عم بصير 7 أيام بشكل آخر.